Joining us here on the show is an NFL analyst for CBS Sports Network. We always love having her here on the show. You can catch her April the 25th on Tops, that other pregame show draft special on CBS Sports Network at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. She's Amy Trask, former NFL executive, and she joins us this morning here on the show. Amy, good morning.
Well, good morning, and thanks for having me.
Always my pleasure, Amy. And let's start with Saquon Barkley because as a running back, he's got all of the tools. Everybody loves him. There doesn't seem to be many negatives about him, but we live in a different age of the NFL. Because of a pass-forward league, does it mean that Saquon Barkley simply doesn't have the value near the top of the draft that he might have once had in previous years?
Well, I'm going to answer that in two separate pieces, the first of which goes to your point about pass-happy. I will never, ever, ever, I think I might have just quoted Taylor Swift in that song, but
Nice.
Whether I did or not, I will never, ever, ever undervalue the importance of a running back, because even in a league where people tend to pass, we know that a running game is instrumental for a good passing game. If you can run the ball, it's easier to pass. If you can pass the ball, it's easier to run. They say of a passing game that a running game is its best friend. So I don't think that running backs will ever or should ever be discounted or deemed unimportant. But to the second part of your question, do you need to go so high? We've seen a lot of examples over the course of history of really, really terrific backs that were found later in the draft. Now, that's not to suggest he's not spectacular and not sensational, and you just said it correctly. Nobody said a bad thing about him. But the question is, do you need to take him that high? And this is a girl who really, really values a running game, questioning that.
Well, it's interesting because while you do need a ground attack to help protect your quarterback or your pass game, we have not seen premier bell cow, alpha male, 25, 30 carry backs carry a team to a Super Bowl in a long time. I mean, the closest might have been Marshawn Lynch, but we know how important that defense was, whether it's the Patriots or the Broncos or the Giants or the Ravens or even the Eagles this year. Are we past the time when a guy like Saquon Barkley is valuable because he can be a 30 carry a day type player?
I don't think we are. And by the way, I'm smiling ear to ear as we're talking about a running game, and you mentioned Marshawn Lynch because, here we go again. They should have given him the ball on that play.
They absolutely should have.
And they'd have been hoisting the trophy. Look, whether we will see that or not, I know that were I a coach, and as Al Davis used to say to me all the time when I'd say, if I were defensive coordinator, he'd immediately interrupt and say, you're not. But were I a coach, I would have a dominant running back if I could find one, and I would emphasize the running game, and I think it makes the passing game better. But that said, you just raised the issue of defense, and the guy that I think is really spectacular up in that top portion of the draft is Bradley Chubb. And I would, were I drafting, prioritize with a higher pick a dominating defender. Von Miller said of Bradley Chubb, he's Von Miller and Khalil Mack all wrapped into one. And if that's even close to true, well, wowee.
Amy Trask joins us, CBS Sports Network. We're a week away from the NFL draft. So I want to ask you about the finances now, since you have worked in the front office for a long time of an NFL franchise, and now we see these balloon type of salaries that quarterbacks now demand. What does that do to how you adjust your draft board in 2018 versus maybe how it was adjusted in 2008?
I don't think it has that much of an effect on the draft board because those salaries are, for the most part, and I'll use the word everyone uses, although it's not technically correct, they're slotted. And when I say not technically correct, the impact is that they are slotted. That's just not what people call it in the collective bargaining agreement or otherwise. But I don't think that those salaries affect your draft board so much as they certainly do affect how you're able to go out and sign free agents and how you're able to then address the salaries of your young players as those initial contracts come towards their expiration. What's going on in Oakland is a very good example. They did Derek Carr's contract over last year, and now they're faced with the prospect of trying to do Khalil Mack's contract over. And we've seen that situation in Los Angeles. The Rams have gone out and signed some very, very, very big-name free agents. And, Aaron Donald is sitting there, must be looking at those numbers going around and perhaps drooling a little bit, but perhaps also drumming his fingers on the table saying, yoo-hoo, I'm here. What are we going to do about me?
Well, the reason I bring that up is because there was once upon a time where you could draft Steve McNair 3rd overall and let him sit for 3 years. Now, because you can't really afford to do that, because as soon as he sits for 3 or 4 years, you've got to then pay him an exorbitant amount of money. Are these teams looking for a quarterback that is ready right away, that they can then supplement around him the other pieces, as you mentioned, to try to win early in a quarterback's tenure, like the Rams are doing with Jared Goff?
Well, that's a terrific, terrific point. And I didn't understand that's where you were headed, because I don't look at that only from a money standpoint, but you're 100% right, that if you let him sit, by the time you're playing, you're towards the end of that contract. I was looking at it from the perspective, you're towards the end of the contract, so the guy may want to leave. Your point's well taken. If you pay him a lot, he may not want to leave. And you use Steve McNair as an example. Another great example, Aaron Rodgers sat for a bit of time behind Brett Favre, and he benefited from that. But you're right, that doesn't happen anymore. I look at it because of the length of time to free agency, but you're right, the money is subsumed within that analysis. As to whether you can find that quarterback who can step on the field and win immediately, maybe, but that's a dicey proposition.
Amy Trask joins us from CBS Sports Network. 1 week until the NFL draft. When you look at all the quarterbacks that'll be selected in the first round here, how many do you think realistically can be long-term starters? Let's not talk about Hall of Famers or even Pro Bowlers, but the solution to these franchises' question marks at quarterback.
I think a few of them can, with a big caveat. And that caveat is this. It depends on the rest of the supporting cast, if you will, his teammates on offense, on defense, his coaches. Is there stability in the coaching staff? There are some young quarterbacks. Look, people that tend to be drafting, teams that tend to be drafting within the top few picks are drafting there because they haven't done well the season before. That's usually the case. There's obviously the instance in which a team that did do well will trade up to draft in those top few picks. But for the most part, those teams are there because they didn't play well. Well, what do we know when teams don't play well? We will see coaching turnover. Even if we don't see head coaching turnover, you're going to see turnover at the coordinator position. So you may bring in a quarterback who could be your quarterback for your starter for years, but not if you're changing offensive coordinators every single year, or system every single year, or if you don't have a defense to support him or a running game to support him. So I think a lot of these prospects are interesting, but so much goes into knowing whether they can start for years.
Cleveland Browns are obviously on the clock. They have been probably since middle of the season. And they own the 1st and 4th picks of the draft, and they've got 5 picks of the first 2 rounds. Now, Sashi Brown is a dirty word in Cleveland. They didn't win much under his regime. However, they're set up pretty well with all of those picks. Is this an instance where you see John Dorsey, the new front office, taking advantage and kind of being the winners because of all the ugly work that the previous regime had to kind of put in and maybe kind of survive through, if you will, to get to this point?
But I will tell you, I smiled when you said that Cleveland's been on the clock since, and before you finished the sentence, I thought you were going to say the last 3 years. But look, Sashi did a phenomenal job amassing draft picks for the Browns. But draft picks don't in themselves win games. You've got to use those picks, use them well, and build a team with them. So to use a very, very tired analogy, he set the table very, very well for those who have succeeded him. And we see that a lot in football, where people set the table well, ultimately lose their jobs, and the people that come in are able to use those utensils, to carry the analogy. They have a lot of picks. And let me say this, if they cannot build a foundation with the amount of picks and where those picks are, there needs to be some head scratching going on back there.
Mm-hmm. Amy Trask joining us from CBS Sports Network. Final question is on the New England Patriots. There's been a lot of smoke around this offseason, which is rare for the New England Patriots. If ever do we see smoke around that organization. Why do you think this offseason has felt maybe more combustible or volatile than we have in the last 19 years combined, basically, in Foxborough?
I think a couple of reasons. Some of this chitter-chatter, smoke, as you called it, started before last season ended. We heard about the issues as between the coach and the personal trainer. There were things bubbling or festering that we were hearing about before the season was over. And then there was the decision to sit the player during the game. And, you know, you really can't find a bigger Bill Belichick fan than I am. So I say this with that backdrop. That was a very, very head-scratching decision, irrespective of the reason, and assuming it was nothing horrendous. And as we've learned, it was nothing horrendous. So I think that added to the consternation, and now the conversation goes on as relates to Gronkowski and perceived uncertainty there. And look, they've been at the top of the heap for a lot of years. Whatever they've done for those years has worked. We've now seen a few issues arise, some of them under the surface, some of them swirling in and out of locker room and off-field things, and then we saw the game itself and that very questionable decision, and I think all of that combines.
Amy Trask, NFL analyst, CBS Sports Network. Catch her April the 25th next week. That other pregame show, Tops, has their draft special on CBS Sports Network. That begins at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Amy this morning on Pacific Time, and we thank her very much for getting up with us this morning. Amy, as always, thanks so much for dropping on by.
Well, thank you. The privilege and pleasure is always mine. I'm a big fan of your show and of your work.
You're too kind. Back at you. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks.
Amy Trask joining us this morning here on the show. Always great stuff from her. Fantastic.